but I'd like to welcome everybody to this next part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. Today we'll be talking about DEI in the workforce and in workforce development programs specifically. So I think we can go ahead and get started at this point. As Dee mentioned, I'm Katie Kuhn, and I am joined by Haji Guan, who helped prepare the presentation, and we'll be on the line to help answer questions at the end. So without further ado, we can get started. So an overview of this webinar today, sort of a roadmap of where we'll be going. We'll start out with some background about what DEI means in the context of workforce development. We're going to talk a little bit about why DEI matters in this particular context, and we will think about how to evaluate DEI impacts in workforce development. From there, we will think about why economic modeling matters in this type of questioning. So when you're thinking about DEI impacts, why should we use economic modeling? Why could that be useful? So we'll say a little bit about ourselves as a company, talk about REMI DEI, the model that we will be using to simulate a particular scenario later on, and then we will get into some specific real-world informed examples. And that will take us into our model demo, after which we will do a little bit of discussion and then jump into a Q&A. So as we go through this webinar, please feel free to take notes and think up any questions that come up along the way, and we'll be happy to do our best to answer them at the end. So just to begin with sort of the framework for what we mean when we talk about DEI in the workforce, because there's layers of meaning to this, but when we're talking about it in this context, we're thinking sort of about these macroeconomic impacts of workforce development programs and what those DEI implications are. So when we think about diversity, we're asking questions like, are all demographic and income groups fairly represented in a region's labor force? We're thinking about equity in terms of whether or not there are equal opportunities for well-paying, sustaining jobs. And when we think about inclusion, we're asking questions like who is being left out of the labor force and what factors might be barring their entry to the labor force. So rather than thinking, sort of smaller scale about DEI in the workforce from the perspective of, one hirer or one employer, we're looking at a region-wide impact of a DEI concerns in workforce development programs. So why does DEI matter to your organization? I'm sure that when you registered for this webinar, you maybe had an idea or, a priority to think about DEI a little bit more in your work. But just some sample reasons for why DEI might matter to you in this economic context. It's because, it's imperative to prepare the workforce for the 21st century and the demands of the 21st century. DEI impacts, when they're appropriately considered, enable a region to really reach its full potential in terms of achieving, a strong workforce, a skilled workforce, and leading the way to economic growth. It matters because economic prosperity should be broad-based. And by considering these distributional impacts of DEI, we can get a little bit better at identifying, how to share that prosperity fairly among everybody. Of course, there's also the federal, state, and local reporting requirements when it comes to DEI. So that's a very practical reason to care. DEI matters in terms of, when you're thinking about workforce development and, thinking about applying to federal grants, et cetera, wanting to be awarded contracts, it's important to be able to say that, to have thought about this and to be able to report these metrics And then finally, to address stakeholder concerns. So this is sort of a brief sampling of reasons why DEI should matter to your organization in the context of workforce development, although I'm sure there are many more that you can think of for your particular organization. So next question, why economic modeling? Why is REMI thinking about DEI? So the key reasons why we are and why economic modeling and DEI matter are because we need to capture the direct and indirect effects of policies. So even policies that are not necessarily intentionally directed at addressing a DEI issue will have very important DEI impacts. So being able to capture those direct and indirect effects of policies and programs really helps us understand, what a policy or project is actually doing, beyond intention or ideology, but what it's really doing in the actual world. Economic modeling matters so that you can understand economic and demographic impacts across industries and over long time periods. It helps to articulate costs, benefits, and trade-offs of policies and projects. It helps clarify who the winners and losers are in a policy situation. It can help illuminate, pieces of a policy or a project that could use, special attention when it comes to DEI impacts or unintended trade-offs, etc. It's also important to evaluate policy with standardized metrics before implementing them. And of course, it helps to clarify complicated policy situations because, as we'll see, even doing a simulation in the model of a policy, we'll see that there are, complicated trade-offs, complicated benefits and costs. So these are really reasons why economic modeling can help in the policymaking process. So we are REMI, Regional Economic Models Incorporated, if you are not familiar with us at this point. We are the leading public policy analysis model for over 40 years. And what we offer are practical software solutions to analyze the dynamic economic and physical impacts of policy changes. So we do this with a number of models. And today specifically, we'll be looking at the DEI extension, which adds these dimensions of race and ethnicity, gender, education level, geography, and income distribution to policy analysis that we've been doing for decades. So a little bit more about REMI DEI. It's a practical software solution. It can model any policy. There's a comprehensive structure. We have thousands of policy variables you can manipulate to simulate any type of policy or project change. Produces accurate results. REMI DEI shows dynamic responses to price and wage changes, models up to 160 industries, and can help you understand how policy affects your specific region. Our models are highly customized, so you are really seeing those results in the regions that you care about. The REMI DEI suite of features notably includes employment by race and gender, employment by education level, regional disparities by county. In this case, we'll be looking at a state model, but you can see regional disparities between states, counties, etc. Labor force by race and gender, income by quintile, and inflation impact by income. So this is a sampling of those key DEI indicators that are incorporated into the REMI DEI model. So having that kind of that background and introduction to who we are and what we do here at REMI, I'd like to get into a little bit more of the meat of the issue. So thinking about workforce development in the context of a real world example, I'd like to look at apprenticeships as a workforce development program that we can take a look at. So this federal workload data, this comes from the Registered Apprenticeship National Results for 2020 from the US Department of Labor. And here, this kind of gives us a demographic breakdown and a better idea of who apprentices are, who's being included in these apprenticeships, before we get into our simulation, where we will look at a specific apprenticeship statewide program and the DEI impacts of that. So as you can see here, active apprentices are overwhelmingly male. Fewer of them are female. So there's some gender imbalance there when it comes to apprenticeships. When we're thinking about race in apprenticeships, we can see that that is also overwhelmingly white at the moment, although there's also representation from these other racial and ethnic groups. And finally, this table gives us a little bit of background on the ethnicity Hispanic or non-Hispanic, whether these populations are participating in a large way in apprenticeships, and it would appear that non-Hispanic groups are more likely to be participating in these programs. So apprenticeship programs are already sort of, more likely to, to include men, white non-Hispanic men, etc. But they're also an example of a workforce development program, that states are starting out and are working to troubleshoot to help bring up everybody in their region, to help bring up, employment, productivity, etc. in their region. So that's why we're using this as a particular example. So thinking about Alabama's Bill 295, this was a 2019 workforce development bill. So this created the Alabama Office of Apprenticeship and started this Alabama registered and industry recognized apprenticeship program. So this is an effort to help bring Alabama citizens into the labor force, to help them get, family sustaining, well-paying jobs, and to help create a workforce that is trained, in the skills needed for the 21st century. So this is one approach to a workforce development bill that bolstered state-level apprenticeship programs and did this by offering apprenticeship tax credits to employers that hire apprentices and helped align that technical training of potential workers with workforce needs so that they could find, that gainful employment. A little bit more on the Alabama Senate bill. This expanded the Apprenticeship Alabama tax credit, specifically also increased the base tax credit, increased the number of apprentices an employer could claim, and increased the tax credit cap, as well as included some decisions about how to use this federal grant, increasing apprenticeship funding, and also the state itself budgeted an additional $1 million towards this goal. So altogether, this bill is a pretty robust example of a state attempting to address its workforce development needs through apprenticeships. So because this is a rather interesting and recent workforce development initiative, I will walk us through a quick demo of this workforce development program. We'll be modeling this still at a hypothetical level, so I don't want to claim that this is a precise analysis of the Alabama Senate Bill 295, but it's informed by some of the real data coming from their website, but we made a lot of simplifying assumptions, simplifying assumptions, and the inputs that we use to model this scenario include a reduction in production costs for industries receiving that tax credit for hiring apprentices. It includes an increase in state government spending, which, as I mentioned in the slide before, models something that the state actually did. And then we made some simplifying assumptions and estimated an increase in labor productivity and modeled all of this over a 10-year time horizon. Oh, before we get to that, I will take us over to the model itself. So I will pull this up. First of all, I will just show us this landing page for REMI DEI. As I mentioned, this is an Alabama model, single region, so we're looking at the whole state of Alabama, and it's a 70 sector model, so this will be the level of industry detail that we will be getting into with this particular simulation. And now I would like to show us the setup for the scenario. So as I mentioned in the slides, we have this tax credit modeled through production cost. We have the state government spending increase here represented. So this is, for the production cost reduction, we have a negative $7.5 million. And the increase in state government spending, we have an increase in $2.2 million. And for the labor productivity increase, we assumed an increase of 0.05%. And each of these inputs has been applied over the full 10-year time horizon. So we can now jump over and begin to look at some of the results of this simulated policy change. So we'll start off with our economic summary table. This is the first result you come to after you run a REMI forecast. And here you can see these more general macroeconomic indicators describing the environment post this economic shock. So we see, as intended and as we'd like to see, an increase in total employment. We can see an increase in population, so people moving into the region, and other population factors leading to this increase for the state. See an increase in the labor force, an increase in GDP, increase in output, increase in personal income as well. So altogether, a pretty happy overall macroeconomic picture. But there's more of a story to tell when we think about DEI impacts. So to fully understand, how a program like this is working and if it's reaching its intended goals, this is where it really matters that we take a look at these type of indicators. So we'll start out by looking at the income distribution suite of features. So this is going to be the distributional impacts from an income perspective of this policy. So looking at the compensation inequality coefficient here, we see a decrease. And to help us kind of understand how to interpret this, this here is a Gini type coefficient. So as a number increases towards 1, that means the region would be becoming more unequal. But because we see this reduction, this negative % change, we're seeing a reduction in inequality as a result of this policy change. So that compensation inequality is reducing over our time horizon. Next, we can look beyond this inequality coefficient to compensation rate weighted by baseline employment to get a better idea of where these employment increases, in this case, we're going to see where these compensation rate increases are occurring. After that, we can look at where those employment increases are occurring by industry. So here, compensation rate weighted by baseline employment, we have this broken up across industry income quintile. So in this particular scenario, we see that the second 20% of all industries by average annual compensation rate weighted by baseline employment, this quintile is experiencing the largest growth in compensation rate. So, one thing to think about in terms of this apprenticeship program, apprenticeships are, often in industries like construction and manufacturing, although there are other ones included. But in this case, for those to be sort of the predominant industries that these apprentices are going into, it sort of makes sense that this second 20% would be seeing the largest increases, as this is the sector, this is the quintile that contains those industries, including construction and manufacturing. We'll see a similar thing in this employment by industry quintile graph. So again, this second 20% is seeing the largest jump in employment. So this second 20% of all industries, they're seeing the greatest rise in employment, and we can think about that in terms of, you know, apprentices going into industries like construction, manufacturing, and others that fall within this 20% of industries. Compensation by industry quintile. So this is pretty similar to the employment by industry quintile graph, but of course is in this case showing us compensation rather than employment. Again, we see that rise for the second 20%, which, you know, again makes sense, maybe thinking about construction and manufacturing falling into this quintile. So that will be sort of the end of these income distributional impacts of this program. And from there, we can jump into the demographic components of these DEI impacts. So here we see employment by demographics. This is broken up into 4 racial and ethnic groups: white non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, other non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. And we can see that white non-Hispanic is seeing overall the largest jump in employment, although there's also notable increases for the Black non-Hispanic group, and increases, you know, to a slightly lesser degree for other non-Hispanic and Hispanic. So again, another way to sort of interpret what's going on here is to think about the proportional makeup of the industries that are seeing these gains in employment. So again, thinking about manufacturing, thinking about construction being 2 of the biggest apprenticeship industries. We can also think about how those are, you know, more overwhelmingly white non-Hispanic men working in these industries. So it might make sense to see this, you know, this jump for white non-Hispanic groups here. I kind of jumped ahead, excuse me, to the gender piece when I mentioned men in this case, but here we can actually see in the data that male groups are being employed at a higher rate than female groups as a result of this policy change. But beyond these demographic considerations, we can also think about DEI in terms of educational attainment. So thinking about the kinds of jobs that are being created, the kinds of jobs that apprentices are being employed in. And we see that there's many more jobs that people in Alabama are being employed in that don't require a bachelor's degree. There's around, there's way more people who are getting employed that don't have a bachelor's degree in jobs that don't require one, as opposed to jobs that do require a bachelor's degree. To look in a little bit more granularity, I think this is you know, an interesting graph beyond just the summary chart. Here we can see this employment by educational attainment across these 7 educational categories. So we can see here that, you know, the overwhelming majority of this employment by educational attainment is being filled by people with high school diploma or equivalent, or those with some college but no degree. So there's a level of accessibility here, you know, captured by the types of jobs this policy change is creating. And again, that might be sort of intuitive when we think about these type of apprenticeship programs. It makes sense that this might not be, you know, targeted to benefit bachelor's degree or master's degree holders, and we can really see that in the numbers here. Moving on to participation rates by demographics. This is labor force participation rate by race and ethnicity here. So we see that white non-Hispanic people are coming into the labor force as a result of this policy at a higher rate than the other groups, although Black non-Hispanic is also, those groups are also coming into the labor force, as well as other non-Hispanic and to a lesser degree Hispanic group. Participation rates by gender. This is a interesting result in that we see that more of the female population is, later on into our time horizon, are being drawn into the labor force at a slightly higher rate than the male populations. So, not only looking at the employment impacts, but also looking at the labor force participation rate impacts. For a state like Alabama, this could be, and other states as well, this could be a particularly interesting thing to look at. As unemployment rates in the state are relatively low, but labor force participation rates are, there's a lot of people not participating in the labor force. So being able to look at this labor force participation rate by demographics, is revealing in another way. Getting back to employment, we can now look at the unemployment rate as a result of this policy. So for the region of Alabama, for the whole state, we see this reduction in the unemployment rate over our 10-year time horizon. And finally, we can look at personal income and those impacts. So we see an increase across the whole state in personal income per capita, and disposable personal income per capita too. We see a modest increase there at the beginning of or in the early years, a little tapering off at the end here. So I will now go back to our slide deck so that we can sort of review those major takeaways from that model simulation. So to review the key results we saw there was a decrease in compensation rate inequality for the state, meaning that the lowest compensation rate earned and the highest compensation rate earned are not as far apart. They were becoming more equal. We also saw increases in employment and compensation rates by industry for the second lowest income quintile. We saw increases in employment, the greatest for the white, non-Hispanic, and male groups. And we explained that by considering the proportional demographic makeup of the occupations and the industries in question. So interestingly, we saw that increase in labor force participation for women, as well as for, I think in that case, it was a larger increase in labor force participation for white non-Hispanic groups, for the white non-Hispanic group, but we also saw some increases for the Black non-Hispanic group. And then overall, a reduction in unemployment across the state and an increase in per capita income. So altogether, I think this simulation kind of drives home the point that when we're thinking about workforce development programs to bring up a region, to create economic prosperity and to ensure that those effects are broad-based, doing this type of an analysis can help reveal, who might be underserved and who might need to be addressed in a, with more, who's being left out and who's benefiting, and sort of how we can approach those policy questions in different ways. Of course, this is one piece of the policy story. So, these were some numbers that can guide the way we think about programs and workforce development programs like this. But when we're thinking kind of holistically about, how to create this broad-based prosperity in a region, there's numbers of barriers to entry. There's numbers of complications that require, different things to think about to get those increases in employment for different demographic groups, gender groups, etc. So I hope that simulation sort of illustrated both what the REMI model and the REMI DEI model can do and it can reveal in terms of what a policy or a program is doing in a macroeconomic sense. But I also hope it reveals sort of the complicated nature of these policy situations and the need for that quantitative part of the picture, when it comes to ensuring that the policy is reaching its goals and benefiting everybody. So the REMI model, it's the only widely available economic model that accounts for these DEI issues. It's authoritative. We use standard metrics to evaluate public policies, and it's academic, peer-reviewed, and our equations are publicly available. To get an idea of sort of the scope of applications that that the model has been used for, we can see this map of the US and see sort of that wide-ranging use both geographically and topically. Essentially, to see these DEI impacts and to take them into account, you don't need to be doing an explicitly DEI-driven policy. You don't need to model something that was specifically a DEI-related policy, even if it's something that does not initially seem to be DEI-related. The DEI impacts can be, very important to take into account as well. So finally, to sort of drive home the thesis about why economic modeling matters in the context of DEI and workforce development, it matters to inform policy with standard metrics rather than ideology or intention. It matters to address stakeholders with evidence, to be able to communicate the story that you want to show about how a policy is benefiting or disadvantaging their communities. It helps to understand economic and demographic implications of policies before implementation, and altogether really helps ensure that public policy serves the broad-based interests of the public. So when we see results that maybe are not, having fully the intended effect that maybe the policy initially wanted to have, or there's a more complicated story being told, it's important to use economic modeling to show that and to be able to understand going forward, how to make public policy that serves the broad-based interests of the public.